Welcome to the Hospital Finance Podcast, your go-to source for information and insights that can help you stay ahead of the challenges impacting healthcare finance. And now, the host of the Hospital Finance Podcast, Michael Passanante.
Hi, this is Mike Passanante, and welcome back to the Hospital Finance Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about overpayments, which is something that maybe doesn't get discussed as much in the industry as underpayments. And joining me is Mary Devine, who is the Director of Revenue Cycle Services here at BESLER. Mary, welcome back to the show.
Mike, thanks for having me again.
So as I just mentioned, we talk about underpayments and underpayment recovery and those types of subjects a lot in the industry, but overpayments don't usually get the same amount of attention. So why don't we start out, can you explain what the technical definition of a Medicare overpayment is?
Sure. And, first let's comment on you are absolutely correct in stating that overpayments do not get quite the attention that underpayments do. I mean, and let's be honest, if you're overpaid, that means you have to give money back, and people do not like to give money back. But let me jump right into what that technical definition of Medicare's overpayment is, or CMS's definition of it. So CMS defines a Medicare overpayment as a payment received in excess of amounts properly payable under Medicare statutes and regulations. And so federal law requires CMS to recover all identified overpayments. And the MACs are the ones that generally initiate the recovery of the overpayment that was received by a provider.
Mary, what are some of the reasons that overpayments would occur?
There's so many of them, but just to name a few, some overpayments can result from medical necessity errors, meaning that you were paid for a service that was rendered to a patient that was not necessary because there was no underlying diagnoses that supported the test or the procedure that the provider was doing. Potentially there's insufficient documentation. So you bill for the administration of a drug, but there's no documentation in the medical record that supports the administering of the drug or the reason to administer the drug. Potentially, there's duplicate payments and administrative errors. So those, if you submit a claim and another provider submits a claim where it should deny as an overlap, but it doesn't, and you both get paid, that would be certainly an error. Potentially, there's an incorrect payee. Medicare is the second payer, and they end up paying primary because they didn't realize there was a workers' comp in place or a no-fault in place. Additionally, services paid to the primary insurance. Maybe, again, Medicare is the secondary. Potentially, it's a working age, and Medicare paid that as if they were primary and not as the secondary and just the co-insurance. And then, as we all know, things change from one fiscal year to the next, and the payments are different, and potentially they paid it on a different year end versus the year that the service actually occurred in. And most of these errors, as you can see, they are at the fault of the provider, but there are certainly some administrative and processing errors that do happen, and the provider is not really at fault for it, if you will.
And if they are, there could be some issues in terms of compliance.
Absolutely.
It doesn't come free. So if you're a provider in that position, what can you do to avoid compliance issues?
For providers to be compliant with billing and Medicare regulations, your claims have to be 100% accurate all the time. So it is, really the responsibility of the providers to perform audits and reviews, and not just on those underpayments that Mike mentioned in the beginning, but also really to dig in and look at some of your overpayments. Because again, where there's underpayments, there's also overpayments. And this can be accomplished through chart-to-bill audits to confirm that all charges that are on that bill are actually supported in the medical record. You also want to make sure that the diagnoses and the procedure codes present on the claim are documented and supported with physician documentation or otherwise within the chart. And generally this is performed within a provider setting by either the compliance or internal auditing teams. And maybe it's outsourced, but it's generally organized by those departments.
And Mary, discharge status codes are often a place where errors occur. You mentioned earlier without fault and at fault claims on the provider side. Can you explain what CMS means when they use those terms?
Sure. So CMS states that providers are responsible for self-reporting overpayments and are liable for all overpayments received unless the provider is without fault. So when we talk about without fault, that means that the provider really shouldn't have known or could not have known, and then the other errors are they are with fault, that they submitted the bill that had the charges on them that aren't present in the chart, or they had the diagnoses codes on them that aren't present on the chart, or they submitted a claim where the procedures are not supported from a medical necessity perspective. So those are at fault, and the ones where the provider is without fault, it really comes to be one of two things. Either the discharge status code is certainly a big area where it's really difficult for the provider to know what happened after post-discharge, although there are ways to go about that. And additionally, any of the MAC processing errors. And if you dug into a MAC processing error or had reason to dig into the claim, you would probably find the processing error, but again, you are definitely would be without fault for those. So if we talk specifically about the discharge status code, when you think of the nature of the claim, you are required by CMS, in order to be compliant with the transfer rule and the coding, that you code the discharge status code to the highest level that you are aware of. So in the example of a patient being coded an 06, it's written in the documentation that the patient's going to receive the home care, but when they're discharged for whatever reason, they don't receive home care, you leave it as an 06. Therefore, that claim would be incorrect, and that would be an example of an underpayment. In the same example, there's no mention in the chart the patient's going to receive home care. There's no reason to put a discharge status code of an 06 on that claim. So you code that in 01, and lo and behold, the patient's home, and they start home care within 3 days. And because of the timing of it or the administrative processing errors, that claim slips through as an 01. That would be an example of the claim being overpaid, but you, the provider, not at fault. And Medicare is quite clear that they have their edits are about 85% accurate when it talks about the processing errors and their rules and their regulations, and that means 15% of the time when you submit a claim through DDE, that the claim could potentially be overpaid because the edits only work 85% of the time.
Mary, how long are providers scrutinized for overpayments?
To be honest with you, this is really kind of a funny point, because when you talk about some of the look-back periods with some of the contracted auditors, they have 4 years. But the look-back period and the responsibility to the providers is 6 years as it relates to overpayments. So that means that providers have the responsibility to ensure that back 6 years there are no overpayments, and if there are overpayments, that they repay them. It's not, when you talk about a RAC look back or timely filing, it's not 4 years, it's not a year, but it is absolutely 6 years for an overpayment.
Do you have any recommendations for providers regarding remediation of overpayments?
As I mentioned before, I would certainly recommend that they perform those internal audits or contracting with an external audit to provide reviews on overpayments, whether it be the discharge status code or on charging and coding. If the OIG comes in and, right now they're focused on discharge status codes, especially the use of condition code 42 and 43, and if you're performing those audits and you self-report, then they're going to find less of an error. But if you don't do the overpayment reviews, they might come in and find a greater error in their sample, and they're going to apply that to a percentage of claims going all the way back 6 years, making your payback a lot more money than it would be had you been performing those audits all along. What they find is a smaller percentage, and then that would mean a smaller payment because the percentage of the payback is much smaller than had you not been performing those audits.
And Mary, you can perform overpayment reviews as part of your transfer DRG revenue recovery service, right?
Yep, we highly recommend it. As I mentioned, if you're looking for the underpayments, you should always be looking for the overpayments as well, just to make sure that your bills, as we mentioned, are 100% accurate all the time, whether it be due that they're inaccurate for an overpayment or an underpayment. You need to make sure they're accurate.
Great advice. Mary, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you.
This concludes today's episode of the Hospital Finance Podcast. For show notes and additional resources to help you protect and enhance revenue at your hospital, visit BESLER.com/podcasts. The Hospital Finance Podcast is a production of BESLER. Smart about revenue, tenacious about results.